Welcome back. In this subunit, we're going to continue to lay the groundwork for your study of contract law by discussing the broad categories of contracts. Naturally, there are too many types of specific contracts for us to list individually, but there are broad categories of contracts that you need to understand to further your study of contract law. We need to understand the difference between express contracts and implied contracts, and we need to understand the difference between bilateral contracts and unilateral contracts. Now, when we're talking about the difference between express contracts and implied contracts, what we're asking is whether the parties formed their contract by words, either spoken or written, or whether the parties formed their contract by conduct. More on that later. When we're discussing the difference between bilateral contracts and unilateral contracts, what we need to ask ourselves is, did both parties to the contract make promises, or did only one party to the contract make a promise? Once again, more on that a little bit later. Let's discuss the difference between express contracts and implied contracts. First, let's give an example of an express contract. Bob says to Mary, "Mary, I will buy your laptop for $400. Mary replies, "Okay, Bob, I will sell my laptop to you for $400. This is an express contract. Why? Because the parties used words to form their contract. They could have used written words or they could have used spoken words. Either case results in an express contract. Now be careful. In the law, and especially in contract law, when we use the word express, when we talk about an express contract or express contract terms, what we mean is that the contract is written or the contract is spoken. Verbal communications. Sometimes outside of the law, when people say express, they mean explicit or clear. That's not what we mean. When we talk about express, what we mean is written or spoken. And indeed, sometimes they might say something, but it might be unclear. All right, let's continue our discussion of the difference between implied contracts and express contracts. Let's discuss what an implied contract is. It's best to understand an implied contract maybe by giving an example. So last week I went to the optometrist and I got an eye exam. As I left the eye exam, the receptionist said to me, "Are you paying by cash or by credit card?" Now, what did I say at this point? Did I say, "I made no express promise to pay. We have no contract. I'm not paying for these services"? Of course not. Of course I paid. Now, why did I pay? Well, because I know we had an implied contract. I made an implied promise to pay for those services. And you say, well, where did that implied promise come from? Well, in this case, it came from prior conduct. I have been to this optometrist many times, and each time I go to this optometrist, I get an eye exam and I pay for the services. Now, maybe, let's make a hypothetical, that I'd never been to this optometrist before. Still, we would say that I made an implied promise to pay for the services. And you say, well, where did that implied promise come from? Well, it comes from custom or community standards. This is the way it happens in virtually every optometrist's office. They charge you for eye exams. So when you go in, you're making an implicit promise to pay for the eye exam. Now, the question is, what is the standard for this, right? It's easy in this specific example, but the standard is, was the other party reasonable in understanding that I was making an implied promise, right? In this case, was the optometrist's office reasonable in understanding that I made an implied promise to pay for the eye exam, right? In this case, clearly the answer is yes, but we could change the facts. We can change the facts so that the optometrist was not reasonable in believing that I was going to pay for these services or that I made an implied promise to pay for these services. So what if on the window to the optometrist's office it said free eye exams? Well, then when I walked in, the optometrist is not reasonable in believing that I made an implied promise to pay for the services. Now let's discuss the difference between bilateral contracts and unilateral contracts. First, let's talk about what a bilateral contract is. Simply, a bilateral contract is where each of the parties to the contract makes a promise. So here's an example. We have a seller who promises to sell and deliver goods to the buyer. We have a buyer who promises to buy the goods from the seller for $10,000. Each of these parties has made a promise. The seller promises to sell and deliver. The buyer promises to buy. This is a bilateral contract. When we think of contracts, normally we think of bilateral contracts. Here's another example. The landlord promises to rent the apartment to the tenant, and the tenant promises to rent the apartment from the landlord. This is a bilateral contract. The landlord makes a promise, the tenant makes a promise. Now, keep in mind that these promises can be either oral or written. As far as we know right now, and I want you to make this assumption, that a contract is legally binding and enforceable, no matter whether it is oral or written. Right? Later in the course, we will discuss the types of contracts that must be written down. But for now, please assume that all contracts are enforceable, no matter whether they are oral or written. Let's continue our discussion of the difference between bilateral and unilateral contracts by discussing what a unilateral contract is. Simply put, a unilateral contract is where one party makes a promise and the other party does not. What does the other party do? The other party performs in response to the promise. Here's an example. Imagine employer makes a promise to his sales staff that he will pay a $10,000 bonus to the salesperson with the highest sales volume. Imagine salesperson X is the salesperson who wins the bonus. Right? Here we have a contract. We have an employer who made a promise to pay $10,000. What promise did salesperson make? Well, salesperson made no promise. What did salesperson do? Salesperson performed in response to the promise. The main characteristic of a unilateral contract is that the promisor is not seeking a return promise. The promisor does not want the other party to make a promise. What the promisor wants is for the other party to perform. And here, in our case with the employer did not want the salesperson to say, yes, I promise to have the highest sales volume. What the employer wanted was performance from the salesperson. And in this case, salesperson X was the salesperson who performed and reached the goal of the highest sales volume. Now, keep in mind, just like for bilateral contracts, a unilateral contract may be oral or it may be written. In either case, it will be enforceable. All right, let's review what we have learned in this brief subunit. We talked about the difference between express contracts and implied contracts. An express contract is where the parties form their contract with words. These words could be oral, spoken, or they could be written. An implied contract is where the parties form their contract by conduct. Right? In the implied contract, there are implied promises, and these implied promises come from the reasonable expectations of the parties based on prior conduct or based on community expectations. We also talked about the difference between bilateral contracts and unilateral contracts. Bilateral contracts are where both parties to the contract make promises. A unilateral contract, on the other hand, is where only one party to the contract makes a promise. The other party does not promise. What the other party does is respond with performance. Going back up to express contracts. Now, naturally, an express contract cannot be an implied contract. Express contracts and implied contracts are mutually exclusive. But an express contract can be either bilateral, a bilateral contract, or it could be a unilateral contract. And similarly, an implied contract can be a unilateral contract, or it could be a bilateral contract. Now, going down and looking at bilateral contracts, naturally a bilateral contract cannot be a unilateral contract. Bilateral contracts and unilateral contracts, they are mutually exclusive. But a bilateral contract can be either an express contract or an implied contract. And similarly, a unilateral contract can be an express contract or it could be an implied contract.